Yep.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, so recording started. So good morning, everybody. Welcome to Charlotte Business Exchange Speaker Series. For those of you who are new to our events, welcome. Those of you who are familiar with us, welcome back. We have a speaker with us this morning who is not the first time for her organization to have joined CBEX. And we're really excited to have them back this morning. The theme for this event, of course, is going to be around the election. We actually had asked Anna if she would do this back in August, and she said, no, there's not enough data. So we pushed it here to September. We're just a few weeks away from a very big election cycle. And instead of having a recap, which is what her predecessor, Joe Stewart, did for us back in 2017, we brought Anna in to give us a preview and talk about what's the lay of the land and maybe even give us some speculation as to what she thinks may happen. So excited to have her here this morning. This is a monthly event. This is our response to what does a networking group do in a pandemic when we can't get together on a face-to-face basis. We've turned to doing monthly events. Next month is wellness in the workplace, and we hope that you'll join us for that as well. So if you have questions, and I hope you do, because I don't have a whole lot for Anna. She's got a ton of material and a ton of information to share with you all this morning. As these questions come up, drop them in chat. Ellen's going to be monitoring that, and we've given her permission to break in if there's a really hot question that's pertinent to what we're talking about at the time. But otherwise, sit back, enjoy your coffee. And Anna, let me allow you to tell a little story about yourself and how you got involved with the North Carolina Free Enterprise Foundation.
Yeah. So it's it's great to be with you guys. Coffee's going to kick in here in a little while, and sentences will make sense soon. But I have been with NC Free for just over a year. It feels like a whirlwind, and way more than a year. But I come from a background of grassroots advocacy. I've been in the political space since graduating from college. I won't say when that was, but since graduating from college and working with voters on specific issue sets around the free market. And it's been a really interesting and fun transition to go from being on the activist side, where I'm involved in the political process, to being on the analysis side, where I get to sit back and watch and talk about it and think about it and figure out what kind of impact it's going to have on a larger community, and that community being the business community. And so NC Free, the way I explain it to my mom, acts like cliff notes for executives and CEOs on how policy passed at the General Assembly impacts business growth in the state. And we do that in a variety of ways, but during an election year, we do that through really helping break down the mystery and narrow focus on which races are really important to watch, why are they important to watch, what's the likelihood of success for either party in shifting control, just sort of being a safe place, because we do come from a nonpartisan perspective, for both sides to ask questions, to get information, and to be able to use that information in their objectives, whether it's making campaign contributions or just nerding out on information. So that's a little bit about who we are.
I love that description of Cliff Notes. So we talked earlier this week in getting ready, and I suggested one path. I'm going to pivot a little bit. I don't think this will surprise you. When we were talking about kind of the landscape and the context that the election this year is taking place in, you mentioned that this is a very ideological time for an election to take place, where you've got a pandemic, we've got an economic crisis, we've got social issues and unrest going on. Can you talk a little bit, as we get into the data, a little about that context that you see and why you are said that this is going to be a more of an ideological type of an election year?
Yeah, I think that COVID has really changed the election in a variety of ways, but specifically because all the issues that are discussed in this election are in context of COVID. So we've got Medicaid expansion in context of COVID. We've got school choice in context of COVID. We have tax reform in context of COVID, and even our rainy day fund in context of COVID. And so the lens that voters and citizens of North Carolina are viewing decisions is through this horrific event that has happened and continuing to happen to many people. That's changing their reality, which is oftentimes going to change the way they view different issue sets. I was reading a poll the other day because nerd. Right. And I was really struck by the particular statistic that over 75% of millennials will be engaged in this election, not because they're following a candidate or attached to a cult of personality, which is typically how it's been with President Obama, but more because they're really truly starting to understand how policy impacts their daily lives because of COVID. Because so many young people have lost their jobs, been furloughed, or had to go on unemployment, or even seen a reduction in their salary because of what has happened with the coronavirus. And that's really caused them to take a step back and to look at how can we solve this problem? This is a huge problem, so how can it be solved? And I saw in the chat, as I stuttered for a second, that involved, that's a great question. Involved means actually taking part in voting and being an activist.
Okay.
And so that, whether, because young people say a lot of things, whether that actually results in a higher turnout of a younger generation than in previous years, I'm not sure yet. We won't find out until later. But I think that it is a step in the right direction for the younger generation to follow policy over cult of personality.
Yeah, I don't think Gen X had that as much involvement politically. I know I didn't. Not many of my friends had that much awareness of the political environment when we were in our 20s, but I could see how, yeah, COVID is definitely impacting this age group. Some of the issues going on around the country socially are impacting, and maybe they're seeing a chance to be able to make that change if they get involved. So that will be interesting.
Yeah, I think that will result in a better outcome for our country if there's more connection to ideology than the whims of candidates and following candidates and the rise and fall. But that's completely a sidebar thing. That's a me being a millennial trying to root for my generation thing.
We need everybody. That we're going to get into that a little bit about the rise and fall of the political election cycle. But before we do that, you have an incredible amount of data that kind of gives a great landscape of the election here in North Carolina. Would you mind sharing your screen and walking through some of the slides that you feel would be relevant to the business group?
Yeah, I would love to. Okay, so this is our starter slide.
Good.
The beginning is a very good place to start. And so I like to start off my presentations usually talking, I pull a quote from whatever I feel like is relevant, but this one I feel like is very relevant for this cycle in particular. From Thomas Jefferson: "We do not have government by the majority, we have government by the majority who participate." And that is, that's always important to keep in context during an election year when people are talking about turning out or not wanting to vote based on their indifference or just no candidate excites them. it's important to realize that it is a privilege that we get to vote and to have an impact on the kind of government that we in the United States get to have. So shifting a little bit to the dynamic of what's going on. So North Carolina has changed a lot in the last 4 years. We've changed a remarkable amount. And so if you look at the gray column, or the registered voters as of, or up to the point of election day in 2016. And then the green column are newly registered voters. We're seeing a huge trend where more and more people who are registering in the last 4 years are registering unaffiliated. And some of the reason for that is we've got people coming in from out of state. We have the younger generation is being more involved in their is in starting to vote, and they're choosing to identify as unaffiliated. That doesn't necessarily mean that they don't know what they believe. That just means that their belief system is sort of a hodgepodge and a mixture between Democrat and Republican. You'll often hear, I am fiscally conservative and socially liberal. That is a very, very common thing for younger generations. And to put in context, we have about 10 million people in North Carolina, and South Carolina has about 5.5 million. So we have more registered voters in North Carolina than South Carolina does in their whole state. That always blows my mind. Growing up, and this is, not everyone feels this way, but I sort of thought that most states were pretty much around the same size, with the exception of California and Rhode Island. But we're dealing with a huge chunk of new voters and new kinds of voters relative to our neighbors. And then looking at those new registered voters, 25% of them are from Wake and Mecklenburg County, which is not going to surprise anybody based on the fact that those are huge hubs for job growth, for opportunity, for just a really nice place to live. Good landscape, good shopping, all the things you could want. And with that, we've also seen through the redistricting process, because this is the third election in a row where North Carolina has new maps, which is not common. We draw one map after the census, and that's supposed to be our map for 10 years. But our maps have been challenged constitutionally, not once, not twice, but 3 and 4 times. And we're the only state in the union to have new congressional and new legislative maps in one election cycle, in the off of the census year. And so the big thing to keep in mind, 61% of new registered voters are under the age of 30. And again, that percentage represents new voters who are coming of age, and then voters who are coming from other places to register. And that takes us to the little pie chart here that I think is probably one of the most important things to keep in mind for the business community as it pertains to policy and the political environment. So we have 33% of our voters, these new voters, are born in the United States, and 45 are in a different state. So for 45% of new registered voters, that means that they don't remember life in North Carolina before 2016. They basically just woke up and it was 2016. And what that means is all of the policies that were passed before 2016, so the state's first largest tax cut this decade was passed before 2016. We had the economic trigger or revenue triggers to bring down the corporate income tax. All of that happened before 2016. And so in this decade, we've gone from being the worst tax and business climate to being one of the best prior to the coronavirus. And so in trying to keep those, this is like going into probably another topic, William, so sorry. In order to keep those trends and to hold fast to our competitive environment, it's going to mean taking into account that there's going to be a huge education component to 45% of these new voters. And that's one of the burdens that NC Free bears, and also a joy that we have in being able to talk about the story of free market in the state. And so shifting a little bit to talk about the generational breakdown, and I spoke a little earlier about the more, the younger the generation, the more inclined they are to be registered unaffiliated. And if you follow that purple line, it backs that up. And I think that is just, I think that's very amusing in the sense that their entire generations of people who are trying to buck really the two-party system, but without saying we want to create a new party. It's more of we want to create our own version of a party, and that means different things to each one of that 48% in Generation Z, to each one of that 46% in the millennial generation. But you're really seeing that in the younger generation Republicans, the Republican affiliation is holding fast. And really so is the Democrat across the board, is sort of within a couple of percentage points. It's just that unaffiliated group that you hear a lot of campaign candidates talking about, and really their ads on television are targeting these people, where they're trying to talk about civility, they're trying to talk about crossing the aisle and solutions and not fighting with one another, but they want to get things done for people. That all of that rhetoric really hits that that purple demographic. And
Hey,
so,
Anna.
yeah, go.
So you had mentioned in an earlier slide, almost 70% of the North Carolina population is registered to vote. If I followed your math right, it's just over 7 million voters, about 10 million.
Yeah.
Is that held consistent over the generations? Like, you know, for the boomer generations, did we have that many registered voters?
That's a good question. It depends on the size of the generation. So I'm trying to figure out. So the percentage at the bottom of this chart tells you the overall as compared. This generation represents of the total generational, like of the total population of registered voters. I don't know that answer. That's a good question. I'm
just curious if we're seeing more
that's
people come in to register, but that's driving up the unaffiliated.
Yeah. In 2018, the millennial generation surpassed Generation X as the largest voting population. And so whether or not relative to their population, they were more registered, that's not been confirmed, as in like, that's not true. The Generation X still had the larger of their generational breakdown. They still had more of their generation registered to vote, if that makes sense.
Gen X.
Yeah, good job, guys. Good job. But yeah, no, that's a great question. Because typically we've seen, as history has really told us, that the older you are, the more you're registered, the more you're taking on this responsibility of voting, because one, it was instilled at a younger age for older generations, and also you've had more time to see the impact of elected officials in your life. And so that is going to encourage you to want to continue to stay involved. But that's a good question. Okay, so that's where I have so far. Next question.
So There's a lot of the headline stories right now are around the national elections. There's a debate coming up here soon. My news feeds are filled with those stories, which makes me think there's probably a lot of stuff going on locally that I am missing out on. And I wondered if you could, highlight what you feel as the stories that are not getting the media attention that do have an impact here at home, whether it's North Carolina or Mecklenburg or Charlotte.
Yeah. So I'll go ahead and share my screen again.
Okay.
So that will take us to some statewide races. And so one thing that I really would like to highlight, and I think is going under the radar a bit too much, are the court races, our statewide court races. We have the Supreme Court and then the Court of Appeals, and we're dealing with 8 races for statewide judicial candidates. And the Supreme Court one in particular is very high stakes. It is literally an all or nothing game time situation here. All the people who are missing sports, which would be me. But so what happened, to put some things in context for you guys, in 2019, Chief Justice Mark Martin resigned, and Governor Cooper appointed Justice Sherry Beasley, who was on the court, but not the most senior member of the court. Typically, when your Chief Justice resigns, you take the next most senior member and they get appointed to that position. And that would have been Associate Justice Paul Newby. He did not get appointed. He is the only judicial seat that is officially up in 2020. And he's also the only conservative on the court. And so he is running for the Chief Justice seat. This is like a battle of the ages sort of conversation. I feel like there should be music in the background. He is running for the Chief Justice seat against Sherry Beasley. And to break down what this, the colors, I didn't say this earlier. So the green color shows the seats that are up for election in 2020. And the reason why the terms for Justice Beasley and Justice Mark Davis are ending in 2020 is because they were appointed with enough time before an election. So they, based on how our state works, they run to retain their seat, which is slightly different than re-election in the sense that they were never elected, they were appointed. So they're running to retain their seat. And Chief Justice Associate Justice Paul Newby is running to be Chief Justice. So they're going head to head on in Newby's seat. It comes to, it's an open seat. So 2 Court of Appeals judges, Lucy Inman and Phil Berger Jr. are running for that seat. And then Associate Justice Mark Davis is running against former state senator Tamara Berenger. And so it is very much Republicans at best can have a 3-4 representation on the court. At worst, it's all Democrat. There's not a single opposition voice on the court. So I would say the Supreme Court races are probably, and I feel comfortable saying this, the most important races that North Carolina is going to see this year, largely because we have, and some of you guys may be familiar with this, we have a business court, which is a superior court level court that specifically handles business issues. Not all states have that, we do. And when the decisions from the business court are appealed, they go directly to the Supreme Court. They bypass the Court of Appeals and go directly to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court is hearing all appeals for business-related issues, which is why we've seen a lot of business-related issues come up through the business court that land in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court have quite a few decisions on those particular policy issues that have.
I feel like I feel like there needs to be a bracket built out here. Um, you're talking about music.
Mhm.
One of the things that you had said, and I saw this on the website when I was looking at it yesterday, you've done interviews, I believe, with all of the judges who are up for election, which is something,
I
can you
feel
talk
like
about that a little bit?
very intimately. Yeah. So one thing that NC Free did in in this time of COVID, we typically have candidate forums where our audience members and lobbyists, whether they're government affairs professionals who lobby on behalf of business or they're business owners themselves, can come and meet new candidates to get to know what are their interests, are they qualified for the job that they're running for, what have you. But since we can't have that, I decided to do interviews. And so NC Free has conducted about 65 interviews of candidates who are running in competitive or open seats in the General Assembly, and also all of the statewide judicial candidates. So all, 16 of them. And through this process, we were able to really peel back some of the layers and find out which former or sitting member of the United States Supreme Court do they most identify with in terms of judicial philosophy? How would they describe their judicial philosophy? What's their background? What sort of history do they have of volunteer work or jobs? And then the most interesting question that, well, this was my favorite question, but I got interesting answers, was what do you feel is the future of the judiciary, and what changes, like what would you advocate for? And it was very interesting to hear a majority of them really want to modernize the judiciary, whether that means increasing technology use so that they can increase access and opportunity for people to engage with their courts, and to understand the process of where their case is going to go. Because there is, I don't know if you guys feel this way, but I certainly do, there's a huge mystery around judges in North Carolina, specifically one of 7 states that elects our Chief Justice by voters. There are many different ways, well, there are 3 major ways to elect your judges. And it's typically divided, a third. It's either through a commission, through merit selection, or the way that the federal court judges, the federal Supreme Court judges are selected. They go through the Senate and then they're confirmed, or we do it by voters. And that's how we do it in North Carolina. Anyway, I could talk about judges for a really long time, but if you are interested in learning more about these individual judges and how they would describe their judicial philosophy, and really that's just a way for them to say, it's almost the equivalent of asking, like, what's your ideological persuasion for a candidate running for office? It's like, what do you think is most valuable when you approach your job as being a judge? I encourage you guys to check those out. We also have fact sheets that outline all the judicial statewide candidates, and then all of the races for the General Assembly that we're watching, which I'm sure we're going to get into that in a little while.
Yeah.
But I encourage you guys to check that out and to do some pretty solid, nonpartisan, just pure research. And it's rare and to be able to say that and it be accurate. But yeah, go ahead.
I think that's one of the silver linings of this whole COVID pandemic situation that we're in, is this ability for technology to shore up some of the gaps of where we can't get together. There's the likelihood I'd ever attend one of those sessions that you would put on, which would probably be in Raleigh, is slim to none. But now that you've done the research, it's available online, it's accessible for this cycle and into the future. So that's, bravo. Thank you for doing that. One of the things that we mentioned earlier, Anna, was kind of the ups and downs and the whims of political candidates, and the difference you had shared, why the judges' races are so important because they span such a longer time. Like I saw one of the current judges, their term doesn't end until 26.
Yeah.
What is that cycle that they're on? Talk about
Yes,
that.
they run for 8-year terms, and that is one of the ways that, like, that's how our Constitution set it up. But I think that is why, and re-emphasizes why paying attention to our judicial candidates is so important. And this is the one thing I neglected to mention earlier, is that this is the first election for all of these statewide candidates where they're running as partisan individuals. Their party affiliation is on the ballot. Our General Assembly passed that law to be on, I think it was 17 where they did that, so that in 18, the judicial candidates would have party affiliation. And for so long, they ran as nonpartisan individuals. And there's also public financing for judicial candidates. So, and 2012 was one of the first elections where candidates didn't receive public financing. So we as voters did not finance their campaign efforts. And with that, and interestingly enough, 2012 was also, that was Justice Newby's big election. I don't know if any of you guys remember this, but there was this ad. It was called the Banjo ad. And it will get stuck in your head, so I'm not going to really go too far into detail about it. But it was a huge independent expenditure, which is the technical term for a super PAC, where individuals and corporations can give unlimited amounts of money, and it's disclosed once they spend it. And so that is one of the ways that businesses and individuals can have a stronger voice in an election, is through these avenues of whether it's a C4 or a PAC or an independent expenditure to really increase information about certain candidates. And this was a huge, this year was a big year for Justice Newby and that independent expenditure. Thus far, oddly, and this is, I find very strange, we've not experienced major independent expenditure money on either side, Republican or Democrat, around the Supreme Court or Court of Appeals races. You would think that of all years, this would be the one where people are like, this is it. We're gonna spend the money this year. But we're not. It's, and we are toward the end of September. So that does not, I'm not gonna say it does not bode well, but it is, I think it is a reflection of how fractured our efforts, our being all political efforts this cycle, because we've got a president, US Senate, Congress, which is actually seems to be super low on the totem pole because through redistricting, 2 competitive seats shifted to being lean or likely Democrat, that being North Carolina 6 and North Carolina 2. So 6 was where Mark Walker was, and he resigned. North Carolina 2 is where George Holding was, and he resigned. Seeing the writing on the tea leaves that it would have to be a miracle for either one of them to win. So those are shifting to be pickups for Democrats. And North Carolina's most competitive congressional seat is North Carolina 8, and that's Richard Hudson, and that is even that one is a lean Republican. So there's not a lot of competition on the congressional side. Which could be why some of you guys are not really hearing that much discussion about it. And it's kind of a relief with all of the other races that we have that are super high priority and resulting in a lot of stimulation. And so President US Senate, Governor, Council of State, General Assembly, and then also the judicial races. So there's a lot of places where you're seeing external money come in, internal money being spent, fundraising being at all-time highs for Democrats. North Carolina is already one of the state with the most money in the election period. And that, I mean, we all knew it was coming.
Really?
Yeah, yeah.
So let's shift a little bit closer, if we could, into the races that are happening around Charlotte. I think there was a few that you're keeping an eye on here as we come into the 11th hour of this election cycle. Can you talk about what you're looking at?
Yes. So I'll share my screen again. So here we have the breakdown. So I'm going to put some things into context. I think that all data needs to be put into context for it to have an impact. And so in the North Carolina House, State House, we have 120 seats, 65 Republican, 55 Democrat. And when we get to the question of who is in control, who can take control, what does that look like? And so in order for Democrats to have a majority, they need to hold their 55 and pick up 6. And Republicans, in order to have a supermajority, need to hold their 65 and pick up 7. And so that's a huge uphill battle for either side, regardless of the year, even regardless of the wave that could exist. I am not sold that there's going to be any sort of wave. I think that we are going to wake up the day after the election or a week after the election, depending on how these voting by mail ballots work and how many recounts are requested. I think we're going to have exactly the same scenario that we have right now, with Republican control of the House and then also of Democrat control of the governor. But going into the specifics, these are the races overall that we're looking at. So NC Free does, and I talked a little earlier about one of the things that we do is break down the mystery around the political season and the election cycle. But we have a tool that's called a partisan district index, and it is calculated. This year we revised it completely and went back to the drawing board because our state is so different than when we started doing the partisan district index. And so what this does is it calculates the lean of the district. It doesn't predict who will win, but it does describe what happened in the past to put in context how likely candidates are to see a greater challenge, or the likelihood of a district's behavior shifting to allow for a seat pickup or a flip. And so this is the color breakout. The darker the red, the more Republican, darker the blue, the more Democrat. And so I want to stick on this for a second. And these are the 24 races in the House that we are watching closely. And I want to pull out a couple of them, being what I call re-return races. It's a very technical term, and it basically means the candidates who lost in 2018, who were incumbents, they lost in 18, and they're coming back in 2020 to reclaim their seat. There's an interesting dynamic that exists there. Those specifically looking at 98 and 103 with Christy Clark and John Bradford, and then Hunt and Brawley. And Bradford and Brawley have been members in the General Assembly for a good amount of the decade, actually. And they lost in 18, and they're trying to come back and reclaim those seats. And the dynamic that exists is the ability for both of those candidates to say, as your elected official, I did blah, 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 blah. And to really lean on a record, which most challengers do not have that opportunity to lean on that. However, I'll say that there's a massive fundraising difference between the Democrats in the Charlotte area and then the Republicans in the Charlotte area, whether they're returning or they're first-time candidates. It's a shocking difference. And one of the things that a narrative that was put out after the second quarter fundraising is that Democrats were saying that, or more specifically, Republicans were saying we were in session, we didn't have time to fundraise, because in North Carolina, when you're in the legislative session, you cannot fundraise. You can't receive any PAC funding. And so that puts the longer members are in session, that prolongs the amount of time that they have to, or shortens the amount of time they have to fundraise. So with the COVID session, they were in Raleigh or virtually in Raleigh. And so their big narrative was, we haven't had time to fundraise, whereas Democrats were really hitting the ground running because they were largely challengers. But in this scenario, specifically with your Charlotte seats, the incumbents are Democrats and the challengers are Republicans, and you're not seeing that be a real narrative at all. The Democrats are out fundraising and have more money cash on hand. And to put that into context, including the one Senate race in Charlotte that we're watching, which we'll look at in a second, the Democrats have out fundraised 5 times what the Republicans have, and have 5 times the amount of cash on hand. And
do you know the breakdown of that? Is that outside money coming into the state?
It's a little bit of both. The inside, when we look at campaign finance fundraising for their individual campaigns, it can be PAC money from outside, but largely it's their campaign committee's money. When you look at independent expenditure money, that we're going to see more of that when Q3 comes out, because that's where I think a majority of the mail's been dropped, the ads have been placed, and really clarifying who those outside financiers are. So it's a joyful mystery and a play for whenever any of the financing comes out. So I'm not sure if you guys know this, but in election years, there are 4 quarter campaign finance reports that have to be filed by campaign committees and party committees and political action committees. So anybody that is putting any money in this cycle and has an active account has to report. In the odd year, it's twice a year, so mid-year and end of the year. So everyone hangs on those reports, and Q2 being such a significant time and having those numbers reflected, July 7th is when all of that stuff went online, and Q3 numbers will go on at the end of October, which will leave no time for anyone to react. And so focusing on the cash on hand for these campaigns sort of lets you see, one, these candidates are ready to make some nimble decisions in their financing. So do we want to place some last minute ads to react against this? And like an example of that, even on a statewide level, would be no one anticipated that Ruth Bader Ginsburg would die. And so the conversation around Senate appointments and trying to connect your opponent to President Trump, if you're a Democrat, would mean that you have a little bit more money in your coffer to be able to place those ads and to create them with messaging that happened after. So cash on hand is basically your bank account.
Yeah,
so,
that was an interesting part of the data Joe was able to share in 17 of what went into the 2016 cycle.
Yeah.
I want to switch gears a little bit on you here and ask you a question. You've talked to a lot of candidates, and I think to me, one of the things that stands out as a challenge, a problem, an issue with the way politics is happening in the country right now is this partisanship where we can't seem to get anything done. And, you know, reflecting back, some of it seems ideological, actually, that you're just holding a line and not being able to cross over. Are you seeing any, do you see anything different in North Carolina compared to what, you know, we're typically seeing at the more national level?
Yeah, I'll say that the more local the candidates, the more their rhetoric, and I'm going to say the rhetoric because they're not elected yet. In many cases, their rhetoric is on the side of collaboration and partnerships and in wanting to find solutions that work for all voters in North Carolina, all citizens in North Carolina. And that, I mean, ultimately that's why they have decided to run for office, because they want to improve the lives of the people around them. And you saw that specifically, or I did when I was doing these interviews in April, where we were in, I think that was still like 15 days to flatten the curve. And we were in hardcore quarantine, and the Republican candidates were not fundraising. They did not feel comfortable asking their neighbor for money because their neighbor didn't know when they were gonna see a paycheck again, or how long this was gonna last. And so the Republican candidates and Democrat candidates in that time really identified and they were bearing the burden of their community and they did not feel comfortable making an ask for their campaign, which would seem extra in the eyes of many of their community members, but they were really focused on how can we actually improve our community. And that was really interesting and inspiring to see these people who have decided that what they want to do is run for office. And some of this is very idealistic in the approach, but I think at that time, that was what we were seeing. We saw Democrats and Republicans in office on a national level and on a state level, more so on a state level than a national level, really come together and kumbaya, like, how can we get through this? What do we need to do to get through this? And so, and then as we've gotten closer to November, we've seen all of the bills that have been introduced and the conversation and opening up the state really turn more political than solution oriented. But I do think that the most ideological a person will be when running for office is the very beginning. And if they are not then, they will definitely not be when they're elected.
Right. That's hard to keep that perspective. There's a couple of questions through chat. Ellen, do you want to bring those?
Sure. And one of them was, why are maps redrawn so often? And I know it was earlier in your talk, but it was really quite compelling about how often, and the numbers that were changed at the same year. So if you could talk about that a little bit. Yeah.
So in 2011, our maps were drawn by, at that point, it was just a simple majority by the Republicans. And then we had the 2016 election. That map that was drawn in 2011 was challenged based on racial gerrymandering. Our state has been in the news and is used as the example for racial gerrymandering. And so that was redrawn. And for 17, and the court, it went to the courts. They declined it. They said they didn't like it, and a special master, but they didn't decline it in enough time for us to not have the 2018 election. So we had the 2018 election. Those maps were challenged. We had a special master come in, which is also the greatest title of all time. He was a professor from California, came in to help redraw the maps for the General Assembly. The judge accepted half of what the special master drew and half of what the General Assembly did. And then that's where we have sort of new maps that were agreed upon for 2020. So 16, 18, and 2020 were all different maps. And we are guaranteed to have new maps in 2022 based on redistricting. I think based on the census, through this process, we'll probably see our rural districts grow and sort of lose representation because of population, going more toward the satellite counties of Wake and Mecklenburg, and they will increase their representation. And so that is likely to happen. North Carolina, if we get back on track with our census. There's been news recently about how we are not doing well in terms of filling out the census. And so what's at stake with that is that we could pick up a 14th congressional seat. We were really close in 2010 to getting another seat, but definitely now I would be shocked if we did not get a 14th congressional seat. But to sort of answer your question in a roundabout way, but yet directly, we should not have our maps redrawn as much as they are. And it causes a lot of confusion. We've seen a lot of retirements of state level officials because this is the third district in some cases where they've had to get to know their constituents in a new way. It's also the third time that voters have had to try to figure out, who am I voting for? Ideally, with the amount of mail and ads that are being run, you don't get to election day and go, oh gosh, I didn't realize this was who I was voting for. I thought it was the other guy. If you get to that point, then that's just bad, sloppy campaign work. But either way, you still have to learn and feel connected to new elected officials. And if both candidates are new for you, even if they're an incumbent, they're sort of on equal footing. So that's where a lot more money is being spent in races, is to educate your district, because you've spent money educating a different district or a different portion of the district, and you want to narrowly target your audience. So that's also another reason why our elections are getting more and more expensive, is because of the amount of map drawing.
Interesting. Hopefully we'll do a better job in 21 with that map.
I hope so.
I'm going to throw two really quick questions to you. Yeah. And we can't go without saying, right, that it's the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, right? So our grandmothers and maybe our great grandmothers weren't able to vote, and it was in 1920 that women got the right to vote. And we just have to remember that it is a privilege, and I think you mentioned that earlier. And I think with that privilege comes the responsibility of learning more, and you've just been so great about that. But I want to throw two really quick questions, which in the interest of time. One is, do unaffiliated voters skew one way or another in a general election? Which might be a little easier to answer. And the longer answer, which may require you to come back, is when you were talking about the gerrymandering, and certainly we were an unfortunate example. How does that benefit? Does that benefit one party or another? How has that kind of landed? So I will let you take that.
Yeah. So I'll answer your second question first. The map drawing has benefited Democrats more than Republicans. Republicans have had a supermajority in this decade, and through the redistricting process, there are some Republican incumbents that will see a loss in 2020. There are at least two seats in the Senate that will see a loss. And I'm sorry we did not get to the Senate, but it is just as exciting as the House for sure. they will see some flips, and then also in the House there will be some flips as well through the process of redistricting and how they've drawn these new maps. The goal is to have more a General Assembly that is representative of their district and of the population of North Carolina. That is very vague and very difficult to do. And that's where the difficulty has come for both sides, Republicans and Democrats, in drawing maps that are representative of the population of North Carolina to better represent. I mean, if that were the case, there would be more women in the General Assembly if we wanted to better represent our population. But that is a whole nother conversation. And then your first question is on unaffiliated. And how
let me stop you for just a minute there, because it's 8:30 right now, and I just want for folks who need to sign off.
Yeah.
I want to say thank you for this. You said you could stick around a little bit more, so those of you who want the answer to this question, please stick around. Again, Anna, we appreciate you being here with us this morning, sharing your knowledge. Website ncfree.org, and these slides that you shared this morning, I believe you will let us have and share out to our audience here today. Before we kind of sign things off, you've got an interesting research project that is kicking off I think in next year. Can you talk for just a moment about that research project, and then we'll say goodbye to those who have to go to work?
Yeah. So we are doing a census series, and it's covering the last decade of North Carolina, and in 4 particular areas. One is campaign finance. The second is redistricting. The third and fourth are sort of linked together, but it's business growth by industry, or business growth and industry growth by legislative district and county. And so what we're hoping to accomplish with this is to tell the story of free enterprise through data. We know that policy has been passed at the General Assembly, and then we know that the next month or the next cycle, we are voted #1 by Forbes as the best state to do business, or #1 state by Site Selection Magazine, or we're in the top 5 of you name it list for our business climate and business friendliness. And so there's a really fun opportunity for NC Free to step in and say, let's look at this last decade. And so that process we're in it right now. And we are also hoping to, it'll be done sometime around Election Day, which means we're going to hold it until the very beginning of next year and go on a pretty robust tour of the first quarter of next year until we receive the new 2020 results in the end of March. But I hope to be back to talk about that with you guys. There'll be some really interesting talking points and some information that is gleaned from it that will be very informative.
Great. Yeah, I think we'd love to have you back to talk about that and maybe reflect on this conversation.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you guys so much for being here and joining me and letting me just continue to talk about things that I love to talk about. And to answer the last question, and then you guys can sign off if you haven't already. The last question being, we're largely seeing unaffiliated voters break for Democrats. I'll be curious to see what 2020 looks like because we've seen so many unaffiliated new registered voters. Does that mean that they are going to lean toward Democrats, or can we see more of an even split? Typically about 1/3 of the unaffiliated voters are really undecided, and they're the people who like walk into the ballot box and they have no idea who they're going to vote for. I don't know a single person like that, but they're 1/3 of the unaffiliated voters are that way. If you know those people, you're very special. But is that you?
No, I was catching an earbud that was
Oh my
dropping
gosh,
out.
I was like, I thought you did the Napoleon Dynamite, like, yes.
Not
No,
me. I'm not that random.
Yeah. So anyway, does anybody have any other questions while we're here? I appreciate your time. This has been fun.
Yeah, and feel free to come off mute, join the video. Well, while we're sitting around chatting, do you want to speculate any on some of the national stuff going on?
Yeah,
And we can stop actually, whoever's handling recording, let's stop recording and we can take this off record.
I did have my coffee kick in. Thanks, Eric.